I came to the bank begging for a $6,000 loan to save my struggling catering business. My hands were shaking as I handed over my paperwork. But the bank manager looked at his screen, turned completely pale, and said, "Ma'am, you have $67 million in your trust account. Why do you need a loan?" I had never seen that kind of money. Before I tell you how a $67 million secret destroyed my toxic family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The nightmare began the night before inside the grand ballroom of the Atlanta Biltmore Hotel. I was 32 years old and standing in the sweltering heat of the service kitchen, wiping sweat from my forehead. My catering company was barely surviving, and I had taken on the job of catering my sister Vanessa and her husband Julian for their lavish 10th anniversary party. I thought offering my services at a massive discount would finally earn me a sliver of respect from my family. I was completely wrong. Out in the ballroom, hundreds of wealthy guests from my father's mega church mingled under crystal chandeliers. My father, Pastor Calvin, and my mother, Vivian, were busy shaking hands and maintaining their flawless social image. I carried a heavy silver tray of appetizers out through the swinging kitchen doors, trying to remain invisible. Vanessa intercepted me near the center ice sculpture. She wore a custom silk gown that cost more than my entire catering van. Julian stood right beside her, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. His smug expression was something I had grown used to over the past 10 years. He was a white hedge fund manager who loved throwing his money around and making me feel small at every family gathering. Vanessa snatched a crab tartlet from my tray, took one tiny bite, and dramatically spit it into a napkin. "Your trashy catering ruined the vibe of my party," Vanessa announced, her voice echoing loudly enough to make several prominent church elders turn and stare. "You call this food?" I am humiliated. I felt my face burn with shame as the guests began to whisper. "Vanessa, I followed your exact menu requests," I said, keeping my voice low to avoid a scene. "I've been cooking since 4 in the morning to make sure everything was perfect for you and Julian." Julian let out a loud, arrogant laugh. "Perfect," he sneered, looking me up and down. "Renee, the only thing perfect here is how consistently you manage to disappoint everyone. Ever since you chose to bake pastries instead of getting a real corporate job, you have been nothing but a drain on this family. You really thought your little amateur cooking hobby belonged at a high society event." Before I could defend myself, my mother Vivian marched over. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. For years, my mother had made it clear that my existence was a blemish on her perfect affluent lifestyle. She wore her status as the first lady of our church like a crown, and my struggling business did not fit her narrative. "Look at you sweating in front of our VIP guests." Vivian hissed, her smile never leaving her face as she addressed the crowd, but her words meant only for me. "Stop embarrassing your father's church this instant. We invited the mayor and half the city council tonight. You are making us look like we associate with the help." "I am your daughter," I whispered, feeling a familiar lump form in my throat. "I am not the help." Vanessa reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a crumpled invoice. She threw it directly at my chest, and it fluttered down onto my stained apron. "That is the venue fee for the ballroom," Vanessa said, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. $6,000. Since your terrible food ruined my guests' appetites, you are paying for the space. Pay the $6,000 venue fee by tomorrow morning, or get out of this family forever. I stared at the paper on the floor, completely paralyzed. $6,000 would bankrupt my struggling business. I had exhausted my credit lines just buying the premium ingredients Vanessa had demanded for this very event. "You cannot be serious," I pleaded, looking toward my father who had just walked over. "Dad, tell them this is insane. I did this party practically for free." Pastor Calvin adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down his nose at me. "Pay your brother-in-law, Renee," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any paternal warmth. "Julian works hard managing his hedge fund to provide for this family. The least you can do is take responsibility for your failures." Stop acting like a victim and pay what you owe." They walked away, leaving me standing there in my stained apron while the wealthy guests turned away in collective second-hand embarrassment. For my entire life, I had been the family scapegoat. While Vanessa was groomed to be the perfect high society wife, I was treated like an embarrassing secret, simply because I chose to build a business with my own hands instead of marrying into money. I retreated to the kitchen, stripping off my apron with shaking hands, the crushing weight of their cruelty pressed down on my chest. I remembered all the times Julian had flaunted his wealth at family dinners, tossing $100 bills at the waitstaff just to show off while I struggled to pay my rent. I remembered my parents buying Vanessa a luxury condo for her graduation while they handed me a generic greeting card and told me to figure life out on my own. If I did not pay the $6,000, Julian would undoubtedly use his high-powered lawyers to drag my small business into court and destroy the only thing I had ever built for myself. My family knew exactly what they were doing. They were pushing me into a corner, forcing me to beg for their mercy so they could continue controlling my life. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat at my small kitchen table staring at my bleak financial spreadsheets. My business account was overdrawn. My personal savings were non-existent. The only option left was to humble myself before a bank and beg for a desperate lifeline. The next morning, I put on my best business suit, printed out my meager tax returns, and drove to the largest bank in downtown Atlanta. My stomach churned with anxiety as I walked through the heavy glass doors. I was ready to grovel, ready to promise anything just to get a $6,000 loan to save my company and get my toxic family off my back. I sat nervously in the plush leather chair across from the bank manager, Mr. Harrison. I handed him my application and braced myself for the inevitable rejection. He typed my social security number into his computer, then he stopped. The color drained from his face and he slowly looked up at me. What I did not know as I sat in that quiet office was that my entire reality was about to shatter, and the weapon I needed to destroy my family's empire was already sitting right there in my name. I walked into the bank ready to beg on my knees for a $6,000 loan just to save my struggling catering business from my own sister. Instead, the bank manager looked at his screen, turned completely pale, and dropped a bomb that shattered my entire reality. I did not need a loan because I had $67 million sitting in a secret trust fund. But the real shock came when he handed me a forged document. My wealthy brother-in-law had just tried to freeze the account and declare me legally insane to steal every single penny. Mr. Harrison took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He stared at his computer screen for a long time before looking back at me. The silence in his office was suffocating. I gripped the worn leather handles of my purse. I knew my credit was not great. The catering business had eaten up every spare cent I had, but I was desperate. I leaned forward and started talking fast. "Please, Mr. Harrison, I know my debt-to-income ratio looks bad right now, but I have a solid business plan. I just need $6,000 to pay off a venue fee by tomorrow morning. If I do not get this loan, my family will ruin my company. I have collateral. I can put up my commercial ovens. Just give me a chance." He held up his hand to stop my nervous rambling. His expression was a mix of absolute bewilderment and deep concern. "Renee," he said softly, leaning across his large oak desk. "I am looking at your global financial profile right now. You do not need a loan for $6,000. In fact, you do not need a loan for anything for the rest of your life." I blinked, confused. I felt my chest tighten. Was he mocking me? My brother-in-law Julian was a powerful man in the Atlanta financial world. Had Julian already called the bank to blacklist me? I felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill. "Do not play games with me," I whispered. "I know I am broke. My family reminds me every single day." Mr. Harrison slowly turned his heavy computer monitor around so it faced me. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the screen. I leaned in, squinting at the numbers. There was a primary checking account with $34.12. Below that was a business account overdrawn by $200, but right beneath those was a private trust account. I stared at the balance. My brain simply could not process the string of zeros. $67 million. I stopped breathing. The room spun slightly. I reached out and touched the edge of the desk just to make sure I was still sitting in a real room. "This has to be a mistake," I stammered. "That is not my account. Someone keyed in the wrong social security number." "It is no mistake, Renee," Mr. Harrison said gently. "This irrevocable trust was activated upon the passing of the grantor last week. The funds were fully cleared and transferred into your name 48 hours ago. You are the sole beneficiary of the Beatrice Washington estate." Aunt Beatrice. The name hit me like a physical blow. Aunt Beatrice was my mother's older sister. For my entire life, my mother Vivian and my father Pastor Calvin had treated Aunt Beatrice like a disease. They called her the crazy old bat who lived in a rundown shack on the edge of town. When she developed mobility issues, my parents forced her into a state-run nursing home and never visited her once. They told the church congregation she was senile and practically disowned her because she refused to donate to my father's lavish megachurch building funds. My parents preached about charity every Sunday, but they abandoned their own blood because she did not fit their wealthy high society aesthetic. But I never forgot how Aunt Beatrice used to sneak me hard candies when I was a little girl and tell me I was going to be a queen one day. While Vanessa was busy sucking up to our parents for new cars and designer clothes, I spent my Sunday afternoons sitting by Aunt Beatrice in that depressing nursing home. I would bring her my freshly baked peach cobbler and sit for hours listening to her talk about the world. She always read the Financial Times and watched market reports. My parents laughed at her, saying she was pretending to understand money. They had no idea. Aunt Beatrice was a self-taught investing genius. She had lived below her means for 50 years, quietly pouring her modest salary into early tech stocks and commercial real estate. While my family spent their money on flashy cars and designer bags to impress their wealthy friends, Aunt Beatrice compounded a quiet fortune, and she left every single penny to the only person who treated her like a human being: me. Tears finally spilled down my cheeks. Not tears of humiliation like the night before, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. Aunt Beatrice had seen me. She had seen my struggle, and she had given me the ultimate armor against a family that only valued power. "I have $67 million, I whispered, staring at the screen. "I can pay Vanessa, I can save my business, I can do anything. "You certainly can," Mr. Harrison said, but his voice lacked the celebratory tone I expected. He turned the monitor back toward himself, and his face hardened into a serious frown. He opened a manila folder on his desk and pulled out a stack of documents. "Renee, there is another reason I brought you into this office today." He tapped a silver pen against the papers. "Are you currently experiencing any severe mental health crises? Have you recently signed over your medical or financial rights to a third party?" I wiped my eyes, totally confused. "What?" "No, of course not. I am perfectly fine." "Why would you ask me that?" "Because an hour ago, someone walked into our main branch across town with a medical power of attorney," Mr. Harrison said, his tone turning grim. "This individual presented documents claiming you were experiencing a severe psychological breakdown. They filed an emergency request to assume full legal stewardship over your estate. They explicitly requested an immediate freeze on the Beatrice Washington Trust Fund, claiming you were unfit to manage your own finances." My blood ran cold. The sheer speed and malice of the attack took my breath away. "Who?" I asked, my voice trembling with a new kind of rage. "Who tried to freeze my account?" Mr. Harrison slid the top paper across the desk. I looked down at the signature line. The arrogant, sweeping handwriting was instantly recognizable. It was Julian, my wealthy, arrogant white brother-in-law. The same man who had laughed in my face last night and demanded I pay him $6,000. He had somehow found out about Aunt Beatrice passing and the trust. He probably had an inside connection at the probate office. He knew about the money, and he was using his power in the financial sector to quietly steal it right out from under me before I even knew it existed. My own family was trying to declare me legally insane just to rob me of the only blessing I had ever received. Mr. Harrison looked at me with deep concern. The documents looked incredibly official, Renee. If you had not walked in here today, sound of mind, and acting as the CEO of your own company, the legal department might have approved the freeze by this afternoon. They know Julian at the downtown branch. They trust him. I sat back in the leather chair. The fear that usually controlled me vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating fury. For 32 years, I had played the role of the quiet, obedient disappointment. I had let them step on me because I believed I had no power. But looking at Julian's signature on that fraudulent document, I realized my family had crossed a line they could never uncross. They did not just want to humiliate me anymore. They wanted to destroy me and take my future. Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice dangerously calm, do not reject his application yet. Let my brother-in-law believe the freeze is processing. Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my reaction. Are you sure, Renee? That is a risky game to play with individuals who commit fraud. I am absolutely sure. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my cheap business suit. Julian and my sister think they can throw me away and take what is mine. They think I am just the poor catering girl who will never fight back. Let them think they won. I need them to feel untouchable so I can tear their entire fake empire down to the ground. I walked out of the bank with a special black card in my purse and a fire in my soul. I did not just have enough to pay my venue fee, I had enough to buy their whole world. But my first stop was not my catering kitchen. My first stop was my parents' house where I knew Julian and Vanessa would be waiting to watch me beg. I was going to give them exactly the show they wanted while I prepared the perfect trap. I drove my battered catering van through the heavy iron gates of my parents' estate in Buckhead. The tires crunched against the pristine gravel of the circular driveway, and the massive brick mansion stood before me like a fortress. Usually pulling up to this house made my stomach tie itself into tight, painful knots. I always felt like a peasant coming to beg from royalty. But today, as I gripped the steering wheel, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The heavy black card tucked safely inside my purse was a silent reminder of the truth. I knew their secret. I held the power and they had absolutely no idea. My mother Vivian was waiting for me in the grand foyer. She wore a tailored designer dress just to lounge around the house. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my cheap business suit, with her signature expression of distaste. She told me to wipe my shoes because she just had the imported marble floors polished. I did not say a word. I simply wiped my feet and followed her into the formal living room. The room smelled of expensive leather and fresh lilies. My father, Pastor Calvin, sat in his oversized armchair flipping through a church financial report. Vanessa and Julian were lounging on the velvet sofa. Julian was sipping a dark espresso, and he looked entirely too pleased with himself. His posture was relaxed and arrogant, like a king waiting for a servant to kneel. Glad you could join us, Julian said, setting his porcelain cup down on the glass table. We have some family business to conclude. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed them onto the table with a heavy thud. I have a very simple solution to your $6,000 problem, Renee, Julian said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. As you may know, your Aunt Beatrice passed away recently. It turns out the old woman left you as the sole beneficiary of her estate. Do not get too excited, though. It is a measly $50,000. I kept my face completely blank. $50,000. That was the lie he was going to use to steal my $67 million. He spoke with such casual confidence, assuming I was too ignorant to ever verify the amount myself. I thought about Aunt Beatrice, the woman they had thrown into a state facility and forgotten about. They mocked her while she quietly built an empire, and now they were trying to steal her final gift to me. The problem is, Julian continued, leaning forward and clasping his hands together. Beatrice owes the state nursing home nearly all of that money in back fees and outstanding medical expenses. The probate process is going to be a massive legal nightmare for you. But because I am a generous man, and because you are my wife's sister, I am willing to take this burden off your hands. He slid an expensive silver pen across the glass table toward me. Sign this waiver transferring the $50,000 to my wealth management firm, Julian instructed. I will handle the nursing home debt and all the legal fees for you. In exchange, I will personally tear up the $6,000 invoice from last night. You walk away free and clear without a single debt to your name. And your little catering hobby gets to survive another day. The sheer audacity of his lie took my breath away. He was trying to steal a massive fortune and acting like he was doing me a favor. My father cleared his throat loudly, demanding my attention. It is a very generous offer, Renee. My father said, his voice echoing with the same authority he used at the pulpit. Julian is doing you a massive favor by cleaning up Beatrice's mess. Sign the papers right now so we can put this ugly business behind us. We need to protect the family name from being associated with her unpaid debts. My mother crossed her arms and glared at me. Do not be stubborn for once in your life, Renee. You owe your brother-in-law a massive apology for the embarrassment you caused our family last night. Sign the paper and be grateful he is willing to help someone as ungrateful as you. I looked at the four of them sitting in that opulent room. My father, the respected pastor who preached about honesty and integrity while helping a white hedge fund manager rob his own daughter. My mother, the elegant first lady of the church who cared more about her social image than her own flesh and blood. My sister, the golden child who smiled as she watched me suffer. And Julian, the wealthy outsider who thought he could easily scam a poor black woman out of a generational fortune. They really thought I was stupid. They thought I was so desperate to save my failing catering business that I would blindly sign away my rights without reading a single page or asking a single question. No. The word left my lips quietly, but it echoed loudly in the large, silent room. Julian's smug smile faltered. His eyes narrowed. Excuse me. I said no. I repeated, standing a little taller and looking him dead in the eye. I am not signing anything over to you, Julian. Aunt Beatrice left that estate to me, and I will handle her affairs myself. You ungrateful little brat, my mother hissed, taking a threatening step toward me. He is trying to save you from bankruptcy. He is trying to rob me, I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull the bank documents out of my purse and shove the $67 million balance right in their faces. I wanted to watch them choke on their own greed, but I held my tongue. If I revealed what I knew right now, Julian would just use his expensive lawyers to tie the money up in court for years. I needed to leave and finish setting my trap. I am keeping my inheritance, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm, and I will find another way to pay your venue fee. Julian's face turned a dangerous shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged as he dropped his friendly savior act. He looked at Vanessa and gave her a slight sharp nod. Vanessa stood up from the velvet sofa. Her eyes flashed with pure malicious joy. You brought this on yourself, Renee, she said, pulling her sleek smartphone from her pocket. I warned you last night. You are either part of this family or you are out. She dialed a number and pressed the speakerphone button, holding the phone up for everyone to hear. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Hello, Mr. Sterling? Vanessa said, her voice suddenly dripping with artificial sweetness. This is Vanessa. Yes, the luxury real estate broker. I am calling about the commercial kitchen space my sister currently leases from you. Yes, I know she is behind on her rent again. I am calling to officially inform you that my husband and I have decided we are no longer going to act as her financial guarantors. You should probably terminate her lease immediately before she costs your property management company any more money. She ended the call and smiled at me. A second later, my own phone began to ring loudly in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw my landlord's name flashing brightly on the screen. You just lost your business, Vanessa whispered, her smile widening into a wicked, triumphant grin. The cold Atlanta rain soaked through my cheap blazer in seconds, but I did not move. I stood on the pristine gravel driveway of my parents' Buckhead estate, holding my phone against my chest. The line was completely dead. My landlord had just canceled the commercial lease for my catering kitchen, leaving me with absolutely nothing. Through the massive living room window, I could see Vanessa laughing. She was leaning against Julian, holding a glass of wine, celebrating my destruction. My mother was smiling right alongside them. They expected me to collapse on their front porch. They expected me to come crawling back inside on my knees, begging Julian to take Aunt Beatrice's money just so I could salvage the ruins of my life. I tilted my head back and let the rain hit my face. For the first time in 32 years, I did not feel the urge to cry over their cruelty. Instead, a slow, quiet laugh bubbled up from my chest. The laugh grew louder, echoing over the sound of the thunderstorm. I was not a victim anymore. I was a woman holding a $67 million loaded weapon, and my family had just handed me the perfect excuse to pull the trigger. I climbed into the driver's seat of my battered catering van. The engine sputtered in protest before roaring to life. I locked the doors, turned the heater on high, and pulled my phone back out. I bypassed my usual contacts and dialed the direct private number Mr. Harrison had given me at the bank. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and professional. "Mr. Harrison," I said, wiping the rainwater from my eyes. "I am ready to activate the Beatrice Washington Trust. I need full executive control, and I need immediate liquidity." I can hear the shift in his tone immediately. He sounded relieved. "The account is fully operational, Renee. Your signature is verified, and the funds are entirely at your disposal. Have you decided how you want to handle your brother-in-law's fraudulent freeze request?" "Leave it pending," I instructed, pulling out of my parents' driveway and leaving their mansion in the rearview mirror. "Let Julian think his little legal maneuver is working. I do not want him to know I have access to the money yet. I want to hit them where it hurts first, and I need you to facilitate a purchase for me right now." I drove straight into the heart of the upscale commercial district. The streets here were lined with luxury boutiques, high-end restaurants, and towering corporate high-rises. I pulled my van over into a loading zone across the street from a gleaming 10-story glass building. The gold lettering above the main entrance read, "Buckhead Premier Plaza." The entire top floor of that magnificent building belonged to my sister. Elite Buckhead Realty was Vanessa's crowning achievement. It was a luxury real estate firm. She started with my parents' money, where she spent her days looking down on the rest of the city and hosting lavish networking parties. She loved that office more than anything else in the world. "I am looking at a commercial property on Peachtree Road," I told Mr. Harrison, staring up at the top floor. "I want to buy the entire building, today." There was a brief pause on the line before Mr. Harrison spoke. "Commercial acquisitions usually take months, Renee. There are inspections, negotiations, and zoning reviews." "I do not care about inspections," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady register. "Find out who currently owns the building. Offer them 20% over the market value in pure, unencumbered cash. Tell them the deal closes in 2 hours, or the offer disappears completely. Put the ownership under an anonymous shell company. Name it BW Holdings. I do not want anyone to know I am the buyer." I sat in my van listening to the rain beat against the roof while Mr. Harrison put me on a brief hold. The minutes stretched by, but I felt no anxiety. I watched wealthy businessmen in expensive suits hurry past my van carrying briefcases and umbrellas. For years I had felt so small in this part of town. Now I was about to own the very ground they walked on. Mr. Harrison returned to the line. His voice held a trace of genuine awe. "The current owner is a property management group facing severe liquidity issues. When my legal team presented an all-cash offer 20% over market value, they practically fell over themselves to accept. We are drafting the digital transfer documents right now. As soon as you sign them through our secure portal, you are the sole owner of the entire plaza." My phone vibrated with an incoming email notification. I opened the secure bank portal, typed in my new credentials, and scanned the massive acquisition contract. My hands did not shake at all. I digitally signed my name, authorizing the transfer of millions of dollars with a single tap of my finger. It was done. I owned the building. I owned the lobby. I owned the elevators. And most importantly, I owned the walls surrounding my sister's precious luxury real estate firm. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to do one more thing for me," I said, staring up at the top floor window where the lights of Vanessa's office glowed against the dark, stormy sky. "I need your legal team to draft a formal tenant notice for Elite Buckhead Realty. Send it directly to Vanessa's private email." "What would you like the notice to say?" Mr. Harrison asked. Inform them that under the new anonymous ownership, their current lease agreement is subject to immediate renegotiation, I instructed, resting my head back against the worn driver's seat. Tell them their monthly rent is increasing by 300% effective immediately. If they do not sign the new agreement and pay the first month by Monday morning, they will be formally evicted and their office property will be seized. I will have the legal team send it right now, Mr. Harrison said. Welcome to commercial real estate, Renee. I ended the call and waited. I kept my eyes glued to the glass doors of the lobby. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The storm was finally beginning to clear, leaving a heavy, humid mist over the city. Suddenly, the glass doors burst open. Vanessa marched out onto the wet pavement, ignoring the drizzle. She was holding her phone right up to her face. Even from across the street, I could see the sheer panic and absolute fury distorting her perfect makeup. She was frantically tapping the screen, her mouth open in a silent scream as she read the legal notice. She looked up at her beloved office building, then back down at her phone, completely horrified. I sat in my battered catering van hidden in the shadows and smiled. The eviction notice was just the beginning. The real revenge had only just started. 2 days later, my father hosted his annual Legacy Charity Gala at the downtown Ritz-Carlton. This was the crown jewel of my parents' social calendar, the one night a year where they paraded their wealth and influence in front of the entire Atlanta elite. Normally, my role at this event was to stay hidden in the service corridors, managing the catering staff, and ensuring my mother's expensive hors d'oeuvres were served at exactly the right temperature. I was the invisible, unpaid help, but tonight, I was stepping out of the shadows. I spent the afternoon at a luxury boutique in Buckhead, using my new black card for the very first time. I chose a custom emerald green silk gown that cascaded to the floor, framing my silhouette perfectly. I paired it with diamond drop earrings and a sleek pulled-back hairstyle. Looking in the mirror, I did not see the exhausted catering girl who smelled of cooking oil and desperation. I saw the woman Aunt Beatrice always knew I could be. I looked like money. Not the loud, flashy money my brother-in-law Julian liked to throw around, but quiet, undeniable power. When I pulled up to the valet stand in a rented chauffeur-driven town car, the hotel staff rushed to open my door. I walked through the grand lobby with my head held high, ignoring the confused stares of church elders who were used to seeing me in a stained apron. The ballroom was breathtaking, bathed in golden light, and filled with hundreds of wealthy guests, wearing their finest formal wear. I paused at the top of the grand staircase, taking in the scene. It took exactly 30 seconds for my mother to spot me. Vivian was standing near the champagne fountain chatting with a group of politicians' wives. She caught sight of my emerald gown, and the polite society smile completely vanished from her face. She excused herself abruptly and marched toward me, her designer heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. Before I could even step off the bottom stair, she grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging sharply into my skin. She did not say a word at first. She just dragged me roughly behind a massive floral arrangement near the coat check, completely out of sight from her wealthy friends. Her eyes darted up and down my body, taking in the expensive fabric of my dress and the real diamonds sparkling in my ears. Her face contorted with a mixture of absolute rage and genuine panic. "What do you think you are doing here?" Vivian hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "Who let you inside the main ballroom? You are supposed to be out of business and packing up your little kitchen." I smiled calmly, gently, prying her fingers off my arm. "Good evening to you too, Mother. The gala is a public charity event. I decided to support the community tonight." "Support the community," my mother spat, letting out a harsh, bitter laugh. "With what money, Renee? You could not even afford the venue fee for your sister's anniversary party 2 nights ago. Now you show up to my most important event of the year wearing haute couture. Where did you steal that dress?" I smoothed the silk fabric of my gown, completely unbothered by her accusation. "I did not steal anything, Mother. I bought it." "Do not lie to me," Vivian growled, stepping closer until I could smell her expensive perfume. "I know your catering business is going under. Vanessa told me you are officially bankrupt. Did you max out another credit card just to come here and spite us? Or worse, are you doing something illegal?" Are you escorting now? Take it off before the cops come. Take it off and get out the back door before you humiliate your father and me in front of the mayor. The sheer cruelty of her assumption would have broken me a week ago. My own mother looked at me and assumed I was a criminal or a high-end escort before she would ever believe I was simply successful. I looked at her perfectly painted face and felt absolutely nothing but pity. You do not have to worry about my finances anymore, Mother, I said, my voice low and steady. And I will not be leaving. I have a paddle for the auction tonight. I turned my back on her and walked straight into the main ballroom, leaving her standing behind the flowers, with her mouth hanging open. I glided through the crowd of socialites and executives taking a seat at an empty table near the front. Across the room, I spotted Vanessa and Julian. Vanessa looked terrible. Despite her expensive gown, she was pale and jittery, constantly checking her phone. The eviction notice from her office building was clearly tearing her apart. Julian, on the other hand, looked as arrogant as ever, completely oblivious to the fact that the anonymous landlord destroying his wife's business was sitting in the same room. My father, Pastor Calvin, took the stage as the dinner plates were cleared. He adjusted his microphone and smiled warmly at his wealthy congregation. "It is time for the highlight of our evening," he announced, his booming voice filling the room. "The Legacy Charity Auction. Tonight our premier item is the deed to the historic Westside Community Plot. We are auctioning this commercial land to fund our new youth outreach center. We will open the bidding at $50,000. Julian immediately raised his paddle. He looked around the room, puffing out his chest. He loved these auctions. He loved using church charity events to show everyone how rich and successful he was, while simultaneously grabbing prime real estate for a fraction of the cost. "We have 50,000 from Julian," my father beamed, pointing at his favorite son-in-law. "Do I hear 60? A local business owner raised his paddle. 60,000. Julian scoffed loudly, taking a sip of his bourbon. He raised his paddle again without even looking up. $100,000. He announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let us not waste time, people." The room erupted in polite applause. My father practically glowed with pride. $100,000 going once, going twice. I slowly reached into my elegant clutch and pulled out my bidding paddle. I waited until the absolute last second, letting the silence stretch across the massive ballroom. Then I raised it high in the air. $500,000, I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried through the room like a gunshot. The entire ballroom went dead silent. Heads snapped in my direction. Whispers immediately broke out among the guests as they craned their necks to see who had just outbid the famous hedge fund manager by such a ridiculous margin. On the stage, my father dropped his auctioneer gavel. It hit the podium with a loud clatter. He stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute shock. At the VIP table, Julian nearly choked on his drink. He slammed his glass down and whipped his head around, glaring at me. Vanessa grabbed his arm, her jaw practically hitting the floor. "Renee," my father stammered over the microphone, forgetting his professional demeanor entirely. "What are you doing? You cannot bid that kind of money." I smiled politely and stood up from my chair. I reached into my purse and pulled out the solid metal black card Mr. Harrison had overnighted to me. I held it up so the stage lights caught the matte black finish. It was a card reserved only for the ultra-wealthy, a card Julian had desperately tried to qualify for and failed. "I believe the bid was $500,000, Pastor," I said, my voice ringing crystal clear across the silent ballroom. "Unless my brother-in-law would like to counter." I turned to look directly at Julian. His face was purple with rage. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the black card in my hand, then back up to my face, completely paralyzed. I had just outbid him by 500% and bought the property outright, leaving my toxic family utterly and completely stunned. The heavy silence in the ballroom felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone. My father stood frozen behind the auction podium, his hand gripping the wooden edges so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked at Julian, expecting him to raise his paddle again, but Julian was completely paralyzed. His eyes were locked on the matte black card in my hand, the same card he had bragged about trying to acquire just last month. $500,000. I repeated, my voice slicing through the quiet room. Is there another bid, or are we closing the auction, Pastor? A low murmur rippled through the crowd of wealthy socialites and church elders. My father swallowed hard. He had no choice but to maintain his public facade. He forced a stiff smile and brought the gavel down. Sold to Renee Washington for $500,000, he choked out. The applause that followed was hesitant and confused, but I simply smiled and returned the black card to my emerald clutch. I barely had time to sit down before I felt a sharp hand grab my elbow. It was Vanessa. Her fingers dug into my skin as she dragged me out of the main ballroom and shoved me into a private side corridor. Julian and my parents were right behind her. The moment the heavy oak doors closed, blocking us from the guests, the polite society masks completely vanished. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" Vanessa hissed, pacing back and forth in the narrow hallway. $500,000. You do not even have $500 in your checking account. Who gave you that card? My mother crossed her arms, her face twisted with absolute disgust. I told you, Calvin, she spat, looking at my father. She has disgraced us completely. Look at her standing there in a dress she cannot afford, holding a card she did not earn. Who is it, Renee? Which one of the married men in that ballroom is paying for your life? You have sunk so low that you had to find a sugar daddy just to show off at a church charity event. I stared at my mother, letting her insulting words wash over me. She would rather believe I was selling myself to an older, wealthy man than admit I could be successful on my own. There is no sugar daddy, I said calmly, smoothing the silk of my gown. The money is mine. Do not lie to us, Julian growled, stepping forward and invading my personal space. His face was red and sweat was gathering on his forehead. I know exactly how much you make catering cheap weddings. That black card requires a minimum liquid balance of $10 million. You either stole it or you are sleeping with someone who owns it. Tell me whose name is on that account right now before I call the police for fraud. He was trying to intimidate me using his size and his loud voice to make me cower. For 32 years, that tactic had worked perfectly, but today he just looked desperate. I looked up at him, noticing the slight tremor in his hands. The confident, wealthy hedge fund manager was visibly shaking. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated in my clutch. I pulled it out, ignoring my family as they continued to berate me. It was a secure email from Marcus, the private investigator I had hired right after I left the bank. I knew Julian had inside connections, and I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with before I dismantled his life. I opened the attachment while Vanessa continued screaming about how I was trying to ruin her reputation. The first document on my screen was a detailed financial analysis of Julian's highly praised wealth management firm. I scanned the numbers and my heart skipped a beat. His hedge fund was not just struggling, it was entirely bankrupt. I read the summary paragraph. Julian had been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for the last 4 years. He was using new investor money to pay off early clients and fund his lavish lifestyle with Vanessa. But the well had run dry. He was drowning in millions of dollars of debt, and his firm was days away from a complete federal collapse. That was why he had been so desperate to freeze Aunt Beatrice's trust fund. He needed her $50,000 just to keep the lights on, and he needed the rest of her millions to save himself from federal prison. You listen to me when I am talking to you, my father barked, snatching at my arm. You are going to march back in there and tell the committee that your bid was a mistake. You are going to cancel that transaction, and you are going to leave this hotel immediately. I ignored my father completely, scrolling down to the second attachment in the investigator's report. Marcus had flagged a series of highly suspicious offshore wire transfers that were keeping Julian's fake empire temporarily afloat. I zoomed in on the origin account for those massive monthly payments, expecting to see another defrauded investor. Instead, I saw the name of my father's church. I stopped breathing. I read the account routing numbers again just to be sure. It was the Pastoral Pension Fund, the massive retirement account built by thousands of hardworking church members over the last 20 years. The pieces clicked together in my mind, forming a picture so sinister it made my blood run cold. Julian was not acting alone. My father, the respected pastor who preached about charity and honesty every Sunday, was legally authorizing those transfers. My own father was secretly siphoning millions of dollars out of the church pension fund to prop up his son-in-law's failing Ponzi scheme. They were robbing the entire congregation blind just to keep up the appearance of being the wealthiest family in Atlanta. And they had the nerve to call me a disappointment. I looked up slowly, meeting my father's furious gaze, and then shifting my eyes to Julian's sweating, panicked face. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they could rob everyone around them and face absolutely no consequences. "Are you deaf?" Vanessa shouted, stepping between me and Julian. "Who gave you that money?" I smiled softly, slipping my phone back into my purse. "Nobody gave it to me, Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, dangerous whisper. "But I know exactly where Julian gets his." Julian's face went completely white. He stepped back as if I had physically struck him. My father froze his eyes, darting nervously toward his son-in-law. I turned around and reached for the brass handle of the corridor door, ready to walk back into the party I now practically owned. I had come here tonight to make a statement, but I was going to leave with the power to send both of them to federal prison. I walked out of the Ritz-Carlton with the cool night air hitting my face, feeling like a queen who had just reclaimed her throne. I left my father and Julian standing in the middle of that glittering ballroom, suffocating in their own panic. I knew about the Ponzi scheme, and I knew about the stolen church pension fund. But the high of that victory only lasted until the sun came up the next morning. I woke up to my phone vibrating violently against my nightstand. It was my assistant catering manager, Sarah. Her voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand her. "Renee," she cried, "every single client for the next 6 months just canceled. All of them. They are demanding their deposits back immediately." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "How is that even possible?" Sarah told me to check the internet. I opened my laptop and my stomach dropped. Vanessa had gone to work. Humiliated at the charity gala, my sister had weaponized her elite social circle to utterly destroy my reputation. She had posted in all of her exclusive Buckhead neighborhood groups claiming my catering company had caused severe food poisoning at a private event. She hired internet trolls to flood my business pages with fake one-star reviews, claiming they found glass in their food and that I was stealing from clients' homes. Decades of my blood, sweat, and tears were being erased in a matter of hours by a jealous, bitter woman with a smartphone. Vanessa was making sure that if I did not need her money, I would never make a dime in this city again. I drove to my secondary prep kitchen, a small rented space on the south side of town. I sat on a metal stool surrounded by stainless steel prep tables, listening to the phone ring endlessly, with angry clients canceling their weddings and corporate lunches. I did not shed a single tear. I knew exactly what this was. This was a temper tantrum. This was a desperate family trying to force me back into my place. Right on cue, the heavy metal door at the back of the kitchen swung open. Julian walked in. He stepped over the threshold carefully, as if the very floor of my kitchen might contaminate his expensive Italian leather shoes. He looked around the modest space and wrinkled his nose in pure disgust. "Quite the little urban operation you have here, Renee," Julian said, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his tailored suit jacket. "It is gritty, authentic. It is a shame it is all going up in flames." I did not stand up. I just watched him pace around my kitchen. "You put Vanessa up to this," I said, my voice perfectly flat. Julian chuckled, a dry, condescending sound. "Vanessa has a mind of her own, but she is very protective of our family image. You embarrassed us last night, Renee, flashing a fake black card, making a scene at a church event. We both know people from your background love to play dress-up, but eventually the bill comes due. Your little stunt triggered a lot of concern in the community. People do not want to hire a caterer who associates with shady sugar daddies or criminal elements." The microaggressions dripped from his mouth like poison. He spoke to me as if I was a child with a learning disability. He wanted me to feel poor, uneducated, and helpless. But looking closely at him, I could see the truth masking his arrogance. His eyes were bloodshot. The collar of his shirt was damp with sweat. He was a desperate man watching his fraudulent empire collapse around him. "I can make all of this go away," Julian said, leaning against a stainless steel counter and crossing his arms. I can tell Vanessa to call off her dogs. I can have my public relations team scrub those bad reviews by noon. Your little cooking hobby can survive. All you have to do is be a good, reasonable girl. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the exact same legal waiver he had tried to force on me at my parents' house, the document that would sign over Aunt Beatrice's entire estate to his wealth management firm. Sign the trust over to me, Julian ordered, his voice hardening into a direct threat. You are clearly in over your head, Renee. People like your kind are not built to handle real wealth. You get emotional and make stupid mistakes with your simple mind. Let me manage the money. I will clear your business name, and I will even give you a generous monthly allowance so you can keep pretending to be a CEO. He shoved the paper across the metal table toward me and slapped a pen down beside it. Sign it right now, or I promise you I will make sure you never work in the state of Georgia again. You will be completely bankrupt by Friday. He needed this money to plug the massive hole in the church pension fund. He needed Aunt Beatrice's millions to hide his Ponzi scheme before the federal investigators caught up to him. He was literally begging for his life while pretending to be my savior. I looked down at the paper, then I looked up at Julian. I let my shoulders slump forward, playing the part of the defeated, broken little sister. I let out a long, trembling sigh. You win, Julian, I whispered, keeping my eyes glued to the table. A massive wave of relief washed over his face. He actually exhaled a breath he had been holding. I knew you would finally see reason, he said, his arrogant smile returning in full force. Just sign on the dotted line. I am not signing it without a lawyer present, I said, my voice meek and submissive. If I am giving you everything, I want it done legally so Vanessa cannot come after me later. Julian's smile widened. He was so blinded by his own greed and racism that he did not suspect a thing. He thought he had successfully bullied me back into submission. Fine, he said, snatching the paper back off the table. My legal team will be at my downtown office tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. Do not be late, Renee. I would hate to see your little business permanently destroyed. He turned on his heel and marched out of the kitchen, leaving the door wide open behind him. I sat in the silence for a full minute, listening to the sound of his luxury car speeding away. As soon as he was gone, I sat up straight. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and opened the encrypted file Marcus, the private investigator, had sent me the night before. I bypassed the church pension fund documents and scrolled directly to the bottom of Julian's financial portfolio. I found exactly what I was looking for. Julian had taken out massive commercial loans to fund his lavish lifestyle and his fake hedge fund. All of his debt, his underwater mortgages, and his personal lines of credit were held by a single regional bank in Atlanta called First Georgia Fidelity. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Harrison. He answered immediately. Mr. Harrison, I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face. I need your rapid acquisition team to perform a miracle tonight. I am looking at a regional bank called First Georgia Fidelity. Mr. Harrison pulled up the file on his end. I see it, Renee. It is a mid-sized institution. They have been struggling with bad debt portfolios recently. Are you looking to open an enterprise account with them? No, Mr. Harrison, I said, typing on my laptop. I want to buy the bank. I want to buy the entire institution and assume control of all their outstanding commercial debt portfolios. I need it done before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Mr. Harrison actually laughed. Consider it done, he said. I hung up the phone and looked around my empty, quiet kitchen. Julian thought I was coming to his office tomorrow to sign away my inheritance and beg for my catering business. He had absolutely no idea that when he sat down across that conference table tomorrow, he was not going to be facing his poor sister-in-law. He was going to be staring directly at his new primary debt collector, and I was going to call in every single penny. At 8:45 the next morning, I walked through the towering glass doors of Julian's downtown law firm. The receptionist tried to ask for my name, but I walked right past her, heading straight for the executive conference room at the end of the hall. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. Julian was sitting at the head of the massive glass table, flanked by 2 men in expensive gray suits. Vanessa sat to his right, clutching a designer handbag, while my parents Calvin and Vivian sat on his left, looking entirely too pleased with themselves. They all turned to look at me as I walked in. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers together with a smug, triumphant smile. "Right on time, Renee," he said, gesturing to the empty chair opposite him. "I am glad you decided to be sensible about this." I sat down, placing my sleek leather briefcase on the table. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. "Thank the Lord you are finally listening to reason," Vivian said, crossing her arms. "After the embarrassing spectacle you caused at the gala and the total collapse of your little catering business yesterday, we were worried you would do something else stupid. Julian is doing you a massive favor, Renee. You should be thanking him on your knees." My father nodded solemnly, adjusting his pastoral collar. "Your sister and brother-in-law have a reputation to uphold," he added, his voice full of righteous authority. "We cannot have you dragging the family name through the mud with failing businesses and bad reviews. Signing the trust over to Julian is the only way to protect Aunt Beatrice's legacy. He knows how to handle real wealth." I looked at the four of them sitting there in their expensive clothes, completely unified in their delusion. They honestly believed they had broken me. Julian slid a thick stack of legal documents across the glass table toward me, along with a solid gold pen. "This transfers full administrative and financial control of the estate directly to my firm," Julian explained, his tone dripping with condescension. "Once you sign, I will make a few calls and get those nasty health code violations scrubbed from your catering pages. I will even front you $10,000 so you can pay off your immediate debts. It is a very generous offer, Renee. Do not ruin it by overthinking." I picked up the gold pen and examined it in the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Then I set it down gently on the glass and pushed the documents back toward him. "I am not signing anything, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly steady and calm. The smug smile vanished from Julian's face instantly. Vanessa scoffed loudly, slamming her hand on the table. "Are you out of your mind?" Vanessa shrieked, her face flushing red. "Your business is dead, Renee. I made sure of it. You have nothing left. If you do not sign that paper, Julian is going to let you go bankrupt and you will end up living on the street." I smiled softly, reaching into my briefcase. I pulled out a thick manila folder and placed it squarely in the middle of the table. "My business is doing just fine, Vanessa," I said, locking eyes with my sister. "But I think we need to talk about yours." I slid the folder across the glass until it stopped right in front of her. Vanessa stared at it suspiciously before flipping it open. As her eyes scanned the top document, all the color drained from her face. Her jaw went slack and her hands began to tremble. "What is this?" Julian demanded, trying to snatch the papers away, but Vanessa held on to them in frozen terror. "That is a highly detailed forensic accounting report of Vanessa's interior design company," I explained, leaning back in my chair. "It turns out my sister has been funneling her clients' payments through a series of fake shell companies to avoid paying corporate taxes for the last 4 years. She has defrauded the federal government out of nearly $2 million. The two corporate lawyers sitting next to Julian suddenly sat up very straight, exchanging nervous glances. "You are lying," Vanessa stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at our parents with wide, panicked eyes. "She fabricated all of this. It is a lie." "It is not a lie," I said, tapping the folder. "My investigator pulled the public tax filings and cross-referenced them with the offshore accounts Julian set up for you. The paper trail is undeniable. In fact, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division received an anonymous copy of that exact file at 8:00 this morning. They are probably drafting the audit warrants right now." My mother shot out of her chair, her face twisted with absolute fury. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me. "You vindictive little snake!" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "How dare you frame your own sister for tax fraud? You have always been jealous of Vanessa. You have always hated her success and her beautiful home and her perfect marriage. You are trying to destroy her because you are a miserable failure." My father slammed his fist on the table, causing the water glasses to rattle. "This is a new low even for you, Renee," he roared. "You come into this office and accuse your sister of a federal crime just to deflect from your own incompetence. You will burn in hell for turning on your own blood. We will hire the best defense attorneys in the state to prove you forged those documents." I watched them rally around Vanessa, blindly defending her crimes without a shred of hesitation while tearing me down to the core. They did not care about the truth. They only cared about protecting the golden child. I did not forge anything, Dad, I said, my voice cold and hard. And you might want to save your money for your own defense attorneys. Those offshore accounts are tied directly to the church pension fund. The IRS is going to follow the money straight back to your desk. My father choked on his own breath, his eyes widening in pure terror as the realization hit him. He fell back into his chair, completely speechless. Julian sprang to his feet, knocking his heavy leather chair backward onto the floor. His face was purple with rage, the veins bulging in his neck. The polished, wealthy executive mask was entirely gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. He realized I was not just bluffing. I was dismantling his entire life brick by brick, and I had completely trapped him. "You think you are so smart?" Renee Julian screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down? I built this family. I built this empire. I do not need your stupid signature. I do not need you to sign over the trust." He stormed around the table, glaring down at me with a look of pure, unhinged malice. "I have another way to get that money," he hissed, a dark, sinister smile spreading across his face. "I have always had a backup plan, and it is going to wipe you off the map completely." Without another word, Julian turned and marched out of the conference room, slamming the heavy doors behind him so hard the glass walls actually shuddered. The glass doors were still shaking from Julian slamming them. Vanessa was sobbing silently, staring at the tax fraud documents on the table. My father looked like he was going to be sick, and my mother was just staring at the wall, completely defeated. I did not say another word to any of them. I simply picked up my briefcase and walked out of the conference room, leaving them to choke on the toxic reality they had created. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. Before the doors even opened on the ground floor, my phone started vibrating in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw the name of Mr. Harrison, the senior trust officer at the bank that held Aunt Beatrice's estate. I answered the call, stepping out into the busy downtown street. Mr. Harrison sounded incredibly tense. He told me that Julian had just electronically submitted a set of emergency transfer documents. He requested the immediate release of the entire trust principal directly into his hedge fund's corporate account. Mr. Harrison explained that the paperwork looked highly suspicious, but it contained my exact signature. I stopped walking. I told him that I had just left Julian's office and I had absolutely refused to sign those papers. I asked how Julian could possibly submit a notarized document without my physical presence. Mr. Harrison let out a heavy sigh. He explained that the paperwork bypassed standard verification because it was personally witnessed and guaranteed by a trusted public figure. I asked him whose name was on the witness line. He read the name aloud, and my blood turned to ice. It was Pastor Calvin. My own father had literally signed his name to a forged document. He was so desperate to save his golden son-in-law and protect his own illegal pension fund transfers that he was willing to help steal my inheritance. He had crossed the line from a terrible father to a federal criminal. Mr. Harrison told me he was going to freeze the account immediately and alert the local authorities for attempted fraud. I told him to stop. I told him to do the exact opposite. I instructed him to approve the transfer. I told him to push the paperwork through the system and let Julian think the money was successfully depositing into his hedge fund. Mr. Harrison was completely shocked. He warned me that releasing those funds was incredibly dangerous. I explained my plan, standing there on the sidewalk with the city traffic rushing past me. If we blocked the transfer now, Julian would just claim it was a clerical error or a misunderstanding. He would hire expensive lawyers and slip away with a slap on the wrist. But if the bank approved the transfer and the stolen money officially crossed federal lines into his corporate accounts, it would trigger a massive wire fraud felony. It would upgrade the crime to a federal conspiracy involving both Julian and my father. I wanted them trapped so deeply that no amount of money or church influence could ever save them. Mr. Harrison understood perfectly. He agreed to set up a shadow ledger. The digital interface would show Julian that his accounts were suddenly flush with millions of dollars, but the actual funds would be frozen in a secure federal holding trust. Julian would be playing with ghost money while leaving a permanent digital trail of his crimes. I thanked him and hung up the phone. A slow smile spread across my face. Julian had dug his own grave, and my father had gladly handed him the shovel. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. I spent the afternoon organizing my catering schedule and ignoring the frantic missed calls from my mother. Later that evening, my phone lit up with a notification from the family group chat. I opened the message expecting to see an apology or a desperate plea from my parents. Instead, I saw a massive block of text from Julian. He was gloating. He announced to the entire family that through his own brilliant financial maneuvering, he had completely solved the firm's temporary cash flow issues. He claimed he had just secured a massive private investment that guaranteed the future of his company and Vanessa's lifestyle for decades to come. My mother immediately replied, praising his genius. My father sent a message calling Julian a true blessing to the family. They were all celebrating the successful theft of my inheritance, completely unaware that they were cheering for their own impending prison sentences. Then Julian sent one final message that made me laugh out loud in my empty living room. He told everyone to go out and buy new formal wear. To celebrate his miraculous victory over his doubters, he was hosting a massive luxury gala this weekend to announce his firm's global expansion. He promised it would be the most lavish event the city had ever seen. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the sofa. Julian was going to throw the biggest party of his life using stolen money that did not actually exist. And I was going to be there in the front row watching the federal agents walk through the front doors. I stared at the group chat notification glowing on my screen. Julian was throwing a gala to celebrate his fake victory, but Vanessa was the one orchestrating the social execution. The next morning, my phone buzzed again with a barrage of alerts. Vanessa had sent a digital invitation to the family group chat. It was an elaborate gold-foiled graphic for the Thorne Estate Expansion Gala hosted at the Grand Peachtree Hotel. Along with the invitation, she sent a deeply cruel message explicitly targeting me. I am so thrilled to celebrate my husband's brilliant success with our real family, an Atlanta high society, Vanessa wrote. Renee, please do not embarrass yourself by trying to show up. Security has been given your photo and strict orders to escort you off the premises immediately. This night is about class and achievement, two things your little food poisoning business knows nothing about. Stay in your lane and let the adults handle the real money. My mother replied with a heart emoji. My father sent a praying hands emoji. They were entirely complicit in my banishment. I did not reply. I did not feel the sting of rejection anymore. I only felt the cold, calculated thrill of what I was about to do. Vanessa wanted to ban me from her party. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire city. She had no idea that I was about to change the rules of her entire world. I opened my laptop and pulled up the corporate ownership structure for the Grand Peachtree Hotel. It was a legendary property operated by a struggling regional hospitality group called Apex Prestige. They were heavily over-leveraged and desperate for cash injections. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Harrison. He had just finished securing the ghost ledger for Julian's fake transfer, ensuring the federal trap was perfectly set. Mr. Harrison, I need to make a substantial personal investment this morning, I said, looking out my living room window. I need $15 million routed through my holding company to acquire a majority controlling stake in Apex Prestige Hospitality. Mr. Harrison typed rapidly on his keyboard. That is an aggressive acquisition, Renee, but entirely feasible given their current debt profile. We can execute a hostile buyout of their primary shares within the hour. Is there a particular reason you want this hospitality group today? They operate the hotel where my sister is hosting her gala tonight, I explained. I want to own the building she is standing in. Mr. Harrison actually chuckled, a rare sound for the senior trust officer. Consider it done, he said. I will have the controlling shares transferred to your name by noon. By lunchtime, the massive stack of digital paperwork was signed and the wire transfers had cleared. I was officially the majority shareholder and primary owner of the Grand Peachtree Hotel. I drove to the property that afternoon, pulling my car directly into the underground VIP parking garage. The general manager, a frantic-looking man named Mr. Sterling, was waiting for me near the service elevators. He was sweating profusely, clearly terrified of his new boss, who had just bought his building in a matter of hours. "Welcome to the property, Miss Washington," Mr. Sterling said, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "We are completely at your service. What can I do for you today?" I told him I wanted to see the grand ballroom. We walked through the luxurious corridors, passing crystal chandeliers and thick velvet carpets, until we reached the massive event space. Vanessa was not there yet, but her event planners were rushing around setting up towering floral arrangements and massive ice sculptures carved into the shape of the Thorne family crest. It was a grotesquely lavish display of wealth that Julian did not actually possess. He was throwing a party with money he thought he had stolen from me. I asked Mr. Sterling to bring me the catering manifest for the Thorne Gala. He handed me a silver clipboard. Vanessa had ordered imported caviar, Wagyu beef, and vintage champagne. It was a menu designed to flaunt status and project an image of untouchable elite wealth. She was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a single dinner while her husband's fraudulent empire was about to be raided by the federal government. I looked at the menu and smiled. I handed the clipboard back to Mr. Sterling. I told him that this menu simply would not do. I reminded him that I owned a catering company, and I had very specific standards for the food served in my hotel, especially for an event hosted by my own family. Mr. Sterling looked confused and terrified. "But Miss Washington?" he stammered. "The client has already approved this menu." Mrs. Thorne was very explicit about her demands. She threatened to have my staff fired if everything was not perfect. "I am your boss now, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice perfectly calm but carrying absolute authority. "And I'm telling you that the menu is changing. Call her right now." Mr. Sterling swallowed hard. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Vanessa's number. I stood right next to him and motioned for him to put the call on speaker. The phone rang twice before Vanessa answered. "This better be important, Sterling," she snapped, her voice sharp and dripping with arrogance. "I am at the spa preparing for tonight, and I do not have time for incompetence." Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, shooting a nervous glance at me. "I apologize for the interruption, Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "But I am calling to inform you of a mandatory change to your event. Our hotel was just acquired by a new owner this morning, and she is demanding a complete menu change for your gala tonight." Mr. Sterling held the phone with a trembling hand as Vanessa's furious screams echoed through the tiny speaker. She demanded to know who the new owner was and threatened to sue the entire hospitality group for breach of contract. I simply nodded at Mr. Sterling, and he pressed the button to end the call mid-sentence. He looked absolutely terrified, but I assured him his job was perfectly safe as long as my instructions were followed to the letter. I told him to cancel the caviar, the Wagyu beef, and the vintage champagne. I instructed him to replace the entire menu with the most basic catering package the hotel offered: standard dry chicken breast and wilted side salads. Fast forward to 8 o'clock that evening. The lobby of the Grand Peachtree Hotel was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Atlanta's high society had turned out in full force to witness the rebirth of the Thorne Empire. I stepped through the revolving glass doors, wearing a sleek, understated emerald gown that cost more than Vanessa's entire floral budget. I did not need to wear flashy diamonds or carry expensive handbags to prove my worth anymore. I scanned the massive marble lobby and immediately spotted my family. They were standing near the grand staircase, holding court like absolute royalty. Julian was holding a glass of champagne, laughing loudly at a joke told by a local politician. Vanessa was clinging to his arm, wearing a gaudy diamond necklace that was undoubtedly paid for with stolen church pension funds. My parents stood beside them, looking incredibly smug and self-important as they greeted the city's elite. I began walking slowly across the marble floor directly toward them. The crowd naturally parted for me. My mother, Vivian, was the first one to spot me. Her fake, polite smile instantly vanished, replaced by a twisted mask of pure hatred. She let out a sharp gasp and grabbed my father's arm, pointing her manicured finger directly at my face. "What is she doing here?" Vivian hissed loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. She turned wildly, looking for the hotel staff. Security! She yelled, her voice echoing over the gentle hum of the string quartet playing in the corner. Security! Get over here right now and throw this trash out. Julian turned around and saw me standing there. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh, shaking his head in mock pity. He stepped forward, trying to play the part of the magnanimous billionaire dealing with a crazed and jealous relative. Renee, he said, his voice loud and dripping with condescension. I told you this morning that your little temper tantrums would not work anymore. Are you really so desperate for attention that you would crash a private event? You have absolutely no business being here. This is a closed gala for our investors and elite partners. It is not for failing caterers looking for a handout. Vanessa sneered, clutching Julian's arm even tighter. We warned you not to come, Renee. She spat, her eyes full of venom. You are embarrassing yourself. You do not belong in a place like this. You are completely pathetic. My father glared at me with absolute disgust, adjusting his pastoral collar. Leave before you make this worse for yourself, Renee, he ordered, his voice low and threatening. You have disgraced this family enough for one lifetime. Do not make us have you removed by force. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw 4 large security guards in dark suits pushing their way through the crowded lobby. My mother smiled triumphantly, watching them approach. She crossed her arms and lifted her chin, looking down her nose at me with an expression of pure victory. Finally, Vivian said, gesturing toward the approaching guards. Grab her and physically remove her from the property immediately. If she resists, call the police and have her arrested for trespassing. The guests had gone completely silent, watching the spectacle unfold. Julian took a slow sip of his champagne, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. He thought he had won. He thought he was about to watch me get dragged out into the street like a common criminal in front of all his wealthy friends. The 4 security guards stepped up to me. The head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered man, stopped just inches away. My family waited eagerly for him to grab my arms and humiliate me. Instead, the large man took a respectful step back. He and the other 3 guards formally bowed their heads toward me in perfect unison. Good evening, and welcome, Madam Owner. The head of security, said, his voice ringing out clearly through the dead-silent lobby. We are completely at your service tonight. The entire lobby froze. The string quartet stopped playing in the middle of a chord. My mother's mouth fell open so wide she looked like she might dislocate her jaw. Vanessa dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody even looked down. Julian stared at the head of security, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute confusion. What did you just call her? Julian demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. She is a caterer. She does not own anything. Throw her out right now. The head of security stood up straight and crossed his arms over his broad chest. I am afraid you are mistaken, sir, he said, his voice booming across the quiet lobby. Miss Washington finalized the acquisition of Apex Prestige Hospitality this afternoon. She is the majority shareholder and the sole owner of the Grand Peachtree Hotel. If she wishes you to leave, we will gladly escort you to the exit. My father stumbled backward, bumping into a marble pillar. He clutched his chest, breathing heavily, as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. They had brought me here to humiliate me, but I had literally bought the ground they were standing on. I looked at Vanessa, who was shaking so badly she could barely stand in her designer heels. Her face was entirely drained of color. I did not say a single word to any of them. I did not need to gloat or explain myself. I simply gave them a cold smile, stepped around the shattered glass on the floor, and walked past them toward the grand ballroom. The security team immediately fell into step behind me, forming a protective wall that kept my family completely paralyzed in my wake. I pushed through the heavy gilded doors of the VIP hall. The room was packed with hundreds of wealthy investors, local politicians, and elite socialites. The tables were set with the cheap dry chicken and wilted salads I had ordered earlier. I could see the confusion and quiet disgust on the faces of the guests as they picked at the mediocre food. Vanessa's reputation for luxury was already dying a miserable public death. I saw Julian rushing into the ballroom through a side door. He was sweating heavily, adjusting his tie and trying to force a confident smile onto his panicked face. He knew his world was collapsing, but he was desperate to keep the illusion alive for just a few more minutes. He needed these investors to give him cash tonight to cover the massive hole in his fraudulent accounts. He sprinted toward the main stage, practically shoving a waiter out of the way to get to the microphone. I turned to Mr. Sterling, who had been waiting nervously by the entrance. I told him to take me to the audio-visual control room immediately. We walked up a narrow, carpeted staircase to a darkened booth overlooking the entire ballroom. The technical director was sitting at a massive soundboard wearing a headset. Mr. Sterling tapped the technician on the shoulder. "This is the new owner of the hotel," Mr. Sterling said, pointing at me. "You will follow her instructions exactly." I looked down through the glass window of the booth. Julian was standing at the podium, gripping the microphone with white knuckles. The bright stage lights illuminated the heavy sweat rolling down his forehead. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice echoing loudly through the ballroom speakers. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the massive expansion of the Thorn financial empire. We are standing on the edge of a historic opportunity." I turned to the technician. I told him to cut the primary audio feed to the stage microphone. The technician hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling down the main slider on his board. Down below, Julian kept talking, but no sound came out of the massive speakers. He tapped the microphone. He blew into it. He looked nervously at the sound booth, waving his hands frantically to get our attention. The crowd began to murmur in confusion. The elite guests were already irritated by the terrible food, and now the presentation was completely falling apart. I told the technician to switch the input source for the giant LED screen behind the stage. I handed him a small silver flash drive I had brought in my clutch. I instructed him to plug it into the main presentation computer and mirror the display to the massive screen for the entire room to see. As the technician loaded the files, I left the booth and walked slowly down the stairs. I entered the ballroom from the back and made my way straight down the center aisle. The crowd parted for me, whispering as I walked toward the stage in my emerald gown. Julian was still standing at the podium, smacking the dead microphone against his palm, his face twisted in a silent rage. He looked up and saw me walking toward him. Absolute panic set into his eyes. I climbed the 5 steps to the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. I walked right up to the podium and smoothly took the microphone from Julian's trembling hand. I looked back at the control booth and gave the technician a slight nod. He pushed the slider back up, turning my audio feed on. I tapped the microphone once, and the sharp sound echoed perfectly through the massive room. The entire crowd fell completely silent, watching me. Julian tried to grab my arm, but one of my security guards stepped onto the stage and physically blocked him, pinning him in place. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice calm and projecting absolute authority across the sea of wealthy faces. "My name is Renee Washington. You were invited here tonight to celebrate an empire, but you are actually sitting inside a crime scene." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. I turned to look at Julian, who was struggling helplessly against the large security guard. Then I looked out at my parents and Vanessa, who had just managed to sneak into the back of the ballroom. They looked like they were walking to their own execution. I gave the signal to the control booth. The massive LED screen behind me suddenly illuminated the dark room. There on full display for every investor, politician, and socialite in Atlanta to see were the unredacted offshore bank statements, the forged trust fund transfers, and the IRS tax evasion reports, detailing exactly how Julian and Vanessa Thorn had stolen millions of dollars. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, as hundreds of pairs of eyes darted between my face and the massive LED screen behind me. These were the most powerful and affluent Black leaders in Atlanta, and they were looking at the undeniable proof that the man standing on stage with me was a fraud. I pointed to the highlighted sections of the bank statements projected behind me. "What you are looking at is a classic Ponzi scheme," I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly through the sound system. "Julian Thorn has not secured any international expansion deals. He has been taking the capital you invested in his hedge fund and using it to pay off his catastrophic personal debts and fund his lavish lifestyle. Every single dollar you thought was building generational wealth for your families has been funneled into these offshore accounts. The crowd erupted into a wave of angry whispers and shocked gasps. I saw prominent business owners and real estate developers pulling out their phones, frantically taking pictures of the financial documents displayed on the screen. They were realizing that the golden boy of Atlanta high society was nothing more than a thief in a tailored suit. Julian was completely losing his mind. His face turned a deep shade of purple, and the sweat was now pouring down his cheeks. He looked out at the angry crowd of investors who were starting to demand answers. He realized his entire fake empire was crumbling in real time, right in front of the people he needed to scam the most. "You are lying!" Julian screamed, his voice raw with panic. He shoved past the podium, completely abandoning his polished persona. He lunged across the stage toward me, desperately reaching out to snatch the microphone from my hand. He wanted to silence me before I could expose the rest of his crimes. He never even made it close. The head of security, who had bowed to me in the lobby, moved with terrifying speed. He stepped in front of me and caught Julian by the shoulders, driving him hard into the polished wooden floor of the stage. Two more security guards rushed up the stairs and pinned Julian's arms behind his back. Julian thrashed against the floorboards, screaming that it was all a mistake and that I had hacked his accounts. Vanessa shrieked from the back of the room, covering her face with her hands, as she watched her husband get tackled like a common criminal. The wealthy guests began to step away from the stage, disgusted by the chaotic scene. Some were already dialing their lawyers, demanding immediate freezes on their investment accounts. That was when my father decided to intervene. Pastor Calvin pushed his way through the crowd of horrified investors marching toward the front of the ballroom. His face was twisted in a mixture of righteous fury and absolute panic. He had tied his own reputation to Julian's success, and he was not going to let his golden son-in-law go down without a fight. "Do not listen to this crazy girl!" My father yelled at the top of his lungs, trying to project his voice over the angry murmurs of the crowd. He pointed an accusing finger at me, while I stood perfectly calm behind the podium. "She is completely unstable. She is just jealous of her sister, and she is trying to smear our family name with forged documents. She has always been the bitter child, and she is doing this out of pure spite." The crowd turned their attention to my father, unsure of what to believe. He was a highly respected spiritual leader in the community, and his word carried massive weight. He stood there breathing heavily, demanding that the security guards release Julian and begging the investors to trust the Thorne family. I looked down at the man who had raised me. He was willing to call his own daughter insane just to protect a thief. I did not raise my voice, and I did not argue with him. I simply looked at the control booth and clicked the small remote in my hand to switch to the next slide. The massive LED screen behind me flashed, and the digital image shifted instantly. The offshore accounts and hedge fund ledgers vanished. They were replaced by documents bearing the official gold letterhead of the Sanctuary Fellowship Church. My father's face turned ash white. He stopped yelling and froze, staring up at the 50-foot display of his own financial sins. The documents on the screen were not just simple bank statements. They were the internal ledgers for the church pension fund. This was the retirement savings of thousands of hardworking families, elderly parishioners, and community leaders. Next to those ledgers, I projected a series of authorized wire transfers, all bearing my father's exact signature. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing over the stunned silence of the ballroom. I told the crowd to look closely at the destination accounts for those church funds. I explained that Pastor Calvin had not just turned a blind eye to his son-in-law's massive fraud. He had actively funded it, using the life savings of his own congregation to keep Julian's sinking ship afloat. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars had been drained from the holy sanctuary and routed directly into Julian's corporate holding accounts to cover his fake dividends. The silence in the room lasted for only a few seconds before absolute chaos erupted. This was not just an attack on anonymous corporate investors anymore. This was a deep personal betrayal against the affluent community that had trusted my father with their spiritual and financial lives for decades. A prominent local judge who sat on the church deacon board threw his crystal champagne flute against a marble pillar in a blind rage. The glass shattered, echoing like a gunshot through the hall. Other guests began shouting furiously, surging toward the front of the stage. They demanded their money back. They called my father a thief and a false prophet. The crowd was a sea of absolute fury. Men in tailored tuxedos were tearing up their donation checks and throwing them at my parents. Women in expensive gowns were screaming for the police. The sheer volume of their anger shook the crystal chandeliers above us. My father tried to back away toward the exit, but a group of furious deacons physically blocked his path, refusing to let him escape. My father stumbled backward, clutching his chest as the reality of his public ruin washed over him. The righteous armor he had worn my entire life dissolved, leaving nothing but a terrified old man facing a mob of his own victims. He tried to raise his hands to calm the crowd, but a woman in the front row hurled her wine glass at his feet, splashing dark red liquid across his expensive leather shoes. My mother Vivian could not handle the destruction of her perfect social kingdom. She let out a high-pitched wail and collapsed onto the floor of the ballroom. Her designer gown pooled around her as she sobbed hysterically into her hands. For 30 years, she had built her entire identity on being the untouchable First Lady of the Church and the Queen of Atlanta High Society. Now she was sitting in a puddle of spilled wine surrounded by people who were actively cursing her family name. Julian was still pinned to the stage floor by my security team, sobbing quietly into the polished wood. The illusion of his billionaire lifestyle was completely dead. The federal agents I had coordinated with through Mr. Harrison were likely already pulling up to the hotel loading docks. I stood at the podium looking down at the wreckage of the family that had abused and discarded me. I felt no pity. I only felt the cold satisfaction of truth finally coming to light. Then Vanessa shoved her way through the angry crowd. Her hair was a mess, and her expensive makeup was streaked with tears of pure rage. She stopped right at the edge of the stage, pointing a shaking finger up at me. She ignored the screaming investors and the shattered glass, focusing all her venom entirely on me. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, asking where I got this power. She demanded to know how a failing caterer could possibly buy a hotel and command private security to humiliate her. She screamed that I was nothing but a jealous loser and asked if I thought Aunt Beatrice's $50,000 inheritance made me a god. I threw my head back and laughed. The sound was loud and genuine, and it echoed off the crystal chandeliers above us. It cut right through the heavy tension in the room and made Vanessa physically flinch. She stood there pointing her shaking finger at me with her mouth hanging open in absolute disbelief. $50,000, I repeated, shaking my head slowly. My voice was perfectly calm, but it carried to every single corner of the silent ballroom. Vanessa, you have always been so completely narrow-minded. You and Mom and Dad were always so obsessed with appearances and status that you never actually paid attention to anything real. You only saw what you wanted to see. Aunt Beatrice did not leave me $50,000. I stepped away from the podium and walked right up to the edge of the stage, looking down at my trembling sister. Aunt Beatrice left me $67 million. The entire ballroom let out a collective gasp that sucked all the air out of the room. Wealthy investors and socialites stared at me in pure shock. Vanessa's knees completely buckled. She had to grab the wooden edge of the stage just to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor next to our sobbing mother. Julian stopped thrashing against the heavy boots of the security guards. He simply went limp against the floorboards, his eyes wide with absolute horror as the impossible math finally clicked in his desperate brain. $67 million? I said again, letting the massive number hang in the cold air. Aunt Beatrice saw exactly who this family was. She saw the rot hiding behind the expensive suits and the church robes. She knew Dad was stealing from the congregation to fund his fake empire and buy Mom designer bags. She knew you and Julian were scamming innocent, hardworking people to pay for your luxury cars and your private country club memberships. She trusted me to clean up the mess, And that is exactly what I have been doing while you all thought I was just a pathetic failure baking cupcakes. My father pulled himself up onto his knees. His stained leather shoes slipped in the puddle of spilled red wine. "Renee, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine that sounded nothing like the booming Pastor Calvin everyone knew. "You are my daughter," he pleaded, holding his hands up to me. "We are blood. You cannot do this to your own family." I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible and worthless. "You stopped being my family the day you decided my only value was how well I could serve your rich friends," I said coldly. "You chose to protect a thief because he bought you expensive dinners and boosted your ego. You chose to let Vanessa humiliate me at every single holiday because she married into money and gave you bragging rights. You worshipped wealth instead of God. Well, now I have all the wealth." I turned my attention back to Vanessa, who was shaking so violently her teeth were actually chattering. Her perfectly styled hair was clinging to her wet face. "I bought Julian's entire debt portfolio," I told her, watching the very last drop of color drain from her skin. "Every single toxic loan, every fraudulent mortgage, every terrible investment he made over the last 5 years to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat. I own all of it. I am his only creditor now." Julian let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the floor. He tried to hide his face in his arms, completely shattered by the reality that his sister-in-law now owned his entire existence. "And that beautiful luxury apartment building you love showing off to your elite socialite friends?" I continued, crossing my arms and staring right into Vanessa's terrified eyes. "I bought that too. I finalized the purchase last week through a proxy corporation. You do not own a single brick of that penthouse, Vanessa. You are just a tenant, and your landlord is the sister you just called a failing caterer." Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out, except a strangled, suffocating sob. She looked down at Julian, hoping her golden husband would somehow rise up and fix this nightmare. But Julian could not even look at her. He was staring blankly at the floor, completely broken and waiting for the end. "And this hotel," I said, gesturing to the grand ballroom around us. "I bought this hotel today, just so I could have the absolute pleasure of kicking you out of it myself. You thought you were bringing me here tonight to humiliate me in front of Atlanta high society. You wanted everyone to see me serving you cheap dry chicken while you played the generous wealthy sister throwing pennies at the poor caterer." I walked back to the podium and looked out at the crowd of angry investors and betrayed church deacons. "Instead, you brought all of your victims directly to me," I said, my voice ringing with finality. "You handed me the absolute perfect audience to witness your destruction. You built a house of cards on the backs of innocent people, and you invited me here to blow it down." My mother Vivian was still crying hysterically on the floor, clutching her ruined designer dress. She was mourning the death of her social status, realizing she was going back to being poor and disgraced. My father was kneeling in the wine, looking like a hollow shell of a man staring at the LED screen that proved he was a common criminal. Vanessa was gripping the stage with white knuckles, completely paralyzed by the reality that she was now entirely penniless and publicly humiliated. Julian was pinned under the security team, waiting for the inevitable consequences of his massive fraud. The elite crowd was silent, watching the mighty Thorne family absolutely shatter in front of their eyes. The illusion of perfection was completely dead. The generational wealth was a lie. The spiritual leadership was a scam. They were nothing but thieves and liars, and now every single person in the city knew the truth. There was no coming back from this. Their empire was reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. I looked down at my emerald gown and smiled a small, genuine smile of victory. The timing of everything had fallen into place perfectly. Through the thick walls of the Grand Peachtree Hotel, the distant sound of heavy vehicles approaching broke the silence. The sound grew louder and more urgent, piercing through the quiet tension of the grand ballroom. It was a chorus of wailing police sirens echoing down the city street and pulling up right outside the main lobby doors. The flashing red and blue lights reflecting through the high windows painted the ballroom in an eerie glow. Before anyone could even process the reality of my $67 million inheritance, the gilded double doors of the ballroom burst open. A dozen armed FBI agents wearing dark windbreakers and tactical gear swarmed into the room, followed closely by a squad of Atlanta police officers. The wealthy crowd scattered like terrified insects, clearing a wide path straight to the stage. Walking right behind the lead agent was Mr. Harrison, carrying a thick black briefcase that contained the certified copies of every single fraudulent transfer and offshore account I had uncovered. The guests were dead silent as the heavy boots of the federal agents stomped across the marble floor. The lead agent marched up the stairs to the stage. He did not even look at Vanessa, who was still clinging to the podium in a state of absolute shock. The federal agents surrounded Julian. My private security team stepped back and let the FBI pull my brother-in-law off the floor. Julian's expensive custom tuxedo was wrinkled and covered in dust. The agent grabbed Julian's arms and forcefully wrenched them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the dead, silent room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Julian Thorne," the agent announced, his voice loud and devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and forgery. You have the right to remain silent." Julian started sobbing uncontrollably, begging the agent to listen to him, swearing that he was just trying to fix a temporary cash flow problem. Nobody listened. Two agents grabbed him by the shoulders and began dragging him down the center aisle. The same high society friends who had kissed his ring an hour ago now turned their backs on him, whispering in disgust as the golden boy was hauled away in chains. My father realized what was happening. The holy facade he had maintained for decades completely vanished. Pastor Calvin stood up from the puddle of spilled wine, his chest heaving as he tried to wipe the stain from his pants. He plastered on his best preaching smile, holding his hands up toward the officers as if he were about to deliver a sermon. "Gentlemen, there is a massive misunderstanding here," my father said, trying to sound authoritative and calm. "I am the senior pastor of the Sanctuary Fellowship. These funds were authorized church investments. I demand you unhand my son-in-law immediately." Another FBI agent stepped directly into my father's path, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Calvin Washington," the agent said, completely ignoring my father's pastoral authority. "You are under arrest for embezzlement of church pension funds, conspiracy to commit fraud, and grand larceny." My father gasped, stumbling backward as if he had been physically struck. He looked out at the crowd of his own deacons and church members, desperately, silently begging them to intervene. None of them moved. They simply stared at him with pure hatred and betrayal. The man who had preached about greed and sin every Sunday was crying like a coward as the cold steel cuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. My mother let out another horrifying shriek as they pulled her husband away. She crawled toward the FBI agents, clawing at their legs, but an officer gently pushed her aside. Vanessa watched her husband and her father getting dragged out of the Grand Peachtree Hotel like common criminals. She looked at her mother, sobbing uselessly on the floor. Then she looked at me, standing tall and untouchable behind the podium. She finally realized that her entire universe was gone. There were no more credit cards. There were no more penthouse views or luxury cars. She was broke, and her husband was going to federal prison for a very long time. Her survival instinct kicked in. While the agents were focused on navigating Julian and my father through the angry mob of investors, Vanessa slowly backed away from the stage. She slipped off her designer heels, leaving them on the wooden floor so she could move silently. She crept down the side stairs, keeping to the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains along the wall. She thought she was invisible. She was trying to reach the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, hoping to sneak through the service exit and disappear into the night before anyone realized she was a co-conspirator. She pushed through the kitchen doors, sprinting past the confused culinary staff toward the loading dock alley. She threw her weight against the heavy metal exit door and stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. But she did not find an empty alleyway. 4 police officers stepped out of the shadows, shining their heavy tactical flashlights directly into Vanessa's terrified face. Vanessa threw her hands up, shielding her eyes from the blinding glare of the police flashlights. She screamed that she was a victim and that she had no idea what her husband was doing, but the officers did not care. They grabbed her by the arms and escorted her back into the grand ballroom where the chaos was still raging. From the stage, I watched as Vanessa was marched back through the heavy gilded doors. Her perfectly styled hair was ruined, and she was trembling so violently she could barely walk in her bare feet. She looked up and saw Julian in handcuffs being led away by federal agents. She saw our father, Pastor Calvin, weeping openly as an FBI agent read him his Miranda rights. The mighty Thorne family empire was officially dead. The Sanctuary Fellowship Church had been exposed as nothing more than a piggy bank for a sociopath, and the entire elite crowd of Atlanta had witnessed the spectacular collapse. My mother, Vivian, was still sitting in the puddle of spilled wine on the marble floor. She looked around at the federal agents, the angry investors, and the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. Her entire reality had been ripped away in less than 10 minutes. She had no money, no status, no wealthy son-in-law, and a husband headed to federal prison. She looked up and saw me standing tall behind the podium, guarded by the security team I now employed. The realization finally hit her. I was the only one left with any power. I was the sole owner of the Grand Peachtree Hotel, and I possessed a $67 million fortune that she could not touch. Vivian scrambled to her feet, but her legs gave out and she fell forward. She did not try to stand up again. Instead, she crawled toward the wooden steps of the stage, her ruined designer gown dragging across the dirty floor. She clawed her way up the first few steps, looking at me with eyes completely bloodshot and swollen from crying. "Renee, please!" Vivian sobbed, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic wail. "Please, you have to make this stop. You have to tell them to let your father go. We can fix this. We can pay the money back. Please, baby, you have the money now. You can save us." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life, making me feel like an unwanted burden. "We are family." "Renee!" my mother pleaded, gripping the edge of the stage with her manicured nails. "We are blood. You cannot let them destroy your own flesh and blood. You are my daughter. I am your mother. You have to show mercy." The sheer audacity of her words made my chest tight, but I did not let a single ounce of emotion show on my face. I walked slowly to the edge of the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the wood, and stopped just out of her reach. I looked down at her tear-streaked face and felt absolutely nothing. "Family," I said, my voice cold and loud enough for the remaining guests and officers to hear. "You want to talk to me about blood now?" Vivian nodded frantically, reaching a shaking hand out toward my emerald gown. "Yes, baby, we are family. Please." I took a slow, deliberate step back. Where was that blood loyalty when you watched Julian throw a $6,000 restaurant bill in my face? I asked, my words cutting through her sobs like a knife. Where was that motherly love when you let Vanessa humiliate me in front of her rich friends, calling me a pathetic, failing caterer? Where was the family bond when you sat back and watched your husband steal the life savings from your own black congregation just to fund a white con man's fake empire? My mother gasped, shrinking back as if I had physically struck her. The remaining church deacons in the room muttered in angry agreement, staring at her with pure disgust. "You did not care about blood when you sold out the elderly parishioners who trusted you." I continued, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "You did not care about family when you treated me like a servant in my own life. You only care about blood right now because you are broke, your husband is a thief, and I am the only one holding a checkbook." Vivian covered her face with her hands, weeping loudly onto the floorboards. Vanessa was standing a few feet away, guarded by a police officer, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched our mother grovel. They were completely broken. "You are not my family," I said, staring down at the two of them. "You are just the people who taught me exactly what kind of woman I never want to be." I turned my back on my mother and looked directly at the head of security, who was standing nearby. He stood up perfectly straight, awaiting my command. "Mr. Sterling," I said, projecting my voice with absolute authority. "My mother and my sister are trespassing on private property. Throw them out of my hotel immediately." The bright beams of the police flashlights pinned Vanessa against the cold brick wall of the alleyway. She threw her hands up to shield her eyes, completely frozen like a deer in headlights. One of the officers stepped forward, forcing her hands behind her back and placing her in handcuffs as a person of interest in her husband's massive fraud. She sobbed hysterically and screamed that she was innocent, that she knew nothing about the money, but the officers simply guided her toward the waiting squad car. The entire Thorne family empire had officially collapsed in a single night. Weeks later, the fallout was swift and merciless. The federal justice system ground my family into dust. The evidence I had handed over in that black briefcase was absolutely airtight, leaving them no room to maneuver or negotiate. Julian faced a mountain of federal wire fraud and forgery charges. His expensive legal team abandoned him the second they realized his corporate accounts were completely frozen by the government. He ended up taking a desperate plea deal just to avoid a life sentence. The judge gave him 15 years in federal prison. There would be no country club minimum security facility for him. He was sent to a maximum security penitentiary, stripped of his tailored suits and his fake billionaire persona. The man who used to mock my catering uniform was now wearing an orange jumpsuit, cleaning cafeteria trays for 20 cents an hour. My father, Pastor Calvin, did not fare much better. The scandal completely destroyed the Sanctuary Fellowship Church. The congregation he had manipulated for decades demanded absolute justice. When the truth about the pension fund embezzlement came out, even his most loyal deacons turned against him. He was stripped of his pastoral credentials and sentenced to 5 years. The man who had spent his entire life demanding worship from a velvet-lined pulpit was now sitting in a concrete cell. I heard he tried to start a prayer group among the inmates, but they just laughed at him. His righteous armor was gone, and underneath, he was just an old thief who had stolen from the elderly. With the men locked away, the illusion of the Thorne family wealth instantly evaporated. The federal government seized everything to pay back the victims. The luxury cars, the offshore bank accounts, the designer jewelry. Vanessa and my mother were left with absolutely nothing. The luxury penthouse I had bought out from under Vanessa was immediately cleared out. My management company officially evicted her. She was forced onto the street carrying only a single cheap suitcase of clothes that had not been confiscated as evidence. My mother, Vivian, who had reigned over Atlanta high society like a queen, found herself entirely blacklisted. Her wealthy friends did not just abandon her, they actively pretended they had never known her. She was forced to move into a rundown project housing complex on the far outskirts of the city. The walls of her new apartment were peeling with water damage, and the neighborhood was dangerous. It was a far cry from the crystal chandeliers and marble floors she believed were her birthright. For 30 years, she had judged everyone around her based on their bank accounts, and now she was relying on government assistance just to buy basic groceries. Vanessa, having never worked a real day in her life, had to face the brutal reality of survival. The woman who used to throw $6,000 dinner bills in my face was now waiting tables at a cheap 24-hour diner off the highway. Her expensive manicures were gone, replaced by calloused hands and fingernails smelling of old grease. I heard from Mr. Harrison that she had tried to apply for office jobs, but her name was completely toxic. Nobody wanted a Thorne anywhere near their business. She spent her days getting yelled at by angry customers and a tyrannical shift manager, which was a perfect reflection of how she used to treat the service staff at her elite parties. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in the newly renovated office of my catering company, which had now expanded into a massive corporate event planning firm. I was looking over the final blueprints for my next hotel acquisition when my private cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. I normally would not answer, but something told me to pick it up. I pressed the phone to my ear and heard the unmistakable sound of my mother crying, "Renee, please, Vivian's." voice crackled through the terrible connection. Her tone was hollow and desperate. Please, baby, do not hang up on us. I heard scuffling on the line, and then Vanessa's voice came through. In the background, I could hear the clattering of cheap diner plates and someone yelling out an order for fries. She sounded exhausted and completely broken. Renee, it is Vanessa, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Mom is sick. The apartment has mold, and we cannot afford the heating bill. My feet are bleeding from standing all day at the diner. We have nothing left. They took everything. You proved your point. You won. Please just send us a little money, just enough to get out of this place. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. I looked out at the glittering Atlanta skyline, a city that I now owned a significant piece of. I listened to their pathetic sniffling and their desperate apologies. They told me they loved me. They told me they were sorry for how they treated me. They used the word family over and over again, like it was some kind of magic spell that could undo 30 years of emotional abuse. They begged me to remember that we were blood, and that blood takes care of its own. I let them talk until they ran out of breath. The silence on the line stretched out heavy and expectant. I took a sip of my coffee, perfectly calm. You wanted me to be a failure? I said, my voice cold and smooth, like polished ice. You wanted me to be invisible so you could shine. You stole from innocent people to fund your delusions, and you expected me to just quietly serve you the appetizers while you did it. Mom started crying harder, coughing into the phone and begging me to listen. Vanessa pleaded for just $1,000, swearing she would pay me back from her tips. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I only felt absolute closure. You told me once that I did not belong at your table, Vanessa. I continued, completely ignoring their weeping. You were right. I bought my own table, and there is no space for either of you at it. Enjoy the diner. Before they could utter another pathetic excuse, I pressed the red button on my screen. I blocked the number and set the phone face down on my polished mahogany desk. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the quiet, peaceful air in my beautiful office. The past was finally dead, and I was completely free. 6 months passed since that final phone call. The winter had melted into a bright and beautiful Atlanta spring. I stood in the center of a massive, sunlit courtyard, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and blooming magnolia trees. This was the exact spot where Julian's fraudulent corporate headquarters used to stand before the federal government seized it and auctioned it off. I bought the property for pennies on the dollar and completely tore it down. In its place, I built something real. I looked around at the bustling courtyard of the Beatrice Thorne Culinary and Business Incubator. The space was filled with dozens of state-of-the-art commercial kitchens, collaborative office spaces, and storefronts. Women of color from all over the city were moving through the glass corridors carrying business plans and recipe books. These were women who had been overlooked and underestimated their entire lives. Women who possessed raw talent but lacked the capital to start. They were just like I used to be. Aunt Beatrice's $67 million trust was no longer just a weapon used to dismantle a corrupt family empire. It was a foundation. I had poured a massive portion of the inheritance into funding this center, giving out grants and providing top-tier mentorship to aspiring chefs and entrepreneurs. Everywhere I looked, I saw women tasting new dishes, negotiating vendor contracts, and supporting one another. There was no greed here. There was no toxic competition or fake religious superiority. It was just pure, authentic growth. Mr. Harrison walked up beside me holding a silver tray with a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. He looked around the crowded courtyard with a warm smile of approval. He told me that my Aunt Beatrice would be incredibly proud of what I had done with her life savings. She knew I had the strength to survive the Thorne family, but she also knew I had the heart to build something better. I took the heavy silver scissors from the tray. The dull ache of my past was completely gone. The girl who used to cry in a cramped kitchen while her sister mocked her catering uniforms simply did not exist anymore. Vanessa was still trapped in her greasy diner. My mother was still living her miserable existence in exile, and my father and Julian were rotting in federal prison. They were ghosts to me now. A crowd began to gather around the main entrance of the incubator. Journalists, local politicians, and community leaders were all smiling and holding up their cameras. My head of security, Mr. Sterling, cleared a path for me as I walked up to the thick silk ribbon draped across the front doors. The energy in the air was electric. I looked out at the sea of supportive faces. These were not the fake elite socialites who used to attend my parents' lavish church parties. These were real people who recognized true value and hard work. I did not need to give a long speech. My actions had already spoken loud enough for the entire city to hear. I raised the silver scissors and sliced right through the center of the ribbon. The crowd erupted into deafening cheers and applause. The sound washed over me bright and victorious. Photographers flashed their cameras, capturing the exact moment the new Queen of Atlanta officially opened her doors. I handed the scissors back to Mr. Harrison and stepped back to take it all in. Above the grand glass entrance, massive bronze letters caught the afternoon sunlight. The Beatrice Thorne Incubator for Women in Business. I tilted my head back and looked up at my aunt's name shining brightly against the clear blue sky. A deep, radiant smile spread across my face. The sweet revenge was finally complete and my beautiful new life was just beginning. The ultimate lesson from this story is that sharing the same blood does not give anyone the right to abuse or disrespect you. For years, Renee endured a toxic family dynamic where her worth was constantly minimized and her boundaries were ignored. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and unconditional love, not manipulation and greed. Sometimes the bravest and most necessary step for your own mental health is walking away from the people who only value you when they need something from you. True success comes when you stop seeking validation from a toxic environment and start building a life where your peace of mind is the ultimate priority. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? Tell me your story in the comments below.